All right. Okay. So now. Okay, and now for something completely different. We've been talking about beauty in science and trying to think about how beauty works and taking a deep dive into various fields like business and architecture and the built environment, looking at definitions of beauty across the ages, art and science, convergences and divergences. We've been listening to sculptors and artists and education scholars debate the role of beauty in human flourishing. We're now going to hone in on something very particular, which is democracy. I spent most of my childhood, my entire childhood, in a non-democratic context. And this question of whether there's anything beautiful about democracy is always something that I found an interesting question as a child. I was a citizen of India, the world's largest democracy. It didn't appear to be running very well. And I was in the Arabian Gulf, which felt more comfortable, but you couldn't really voice any ideas or opinions without getting thrown out. So I've often pondered this, and sort of being a citizen of this country for the last few years, I've been really thinking about this, watching alternative ideals emerge that seem to some people more beautiful, more compelling than democracy. So we're going to talk about whether there's anything beautiful about democracy and what that is. I'm very thrilled to introduce our moderator, Dr. Samuel Kimbriel. He's a political philosopher, author, and founding director of Aspen Institute's Philosophy and Society Initiative. He's part of an emerging generation of philosophers rethinking basic questions of individuality, identity, and community. He's author of Friendship as Sacred Knowing, Overcoming Isolation, from Oxford University Press, contributing editor at Wisdom of Crowds, and he writes widely on topics of solidarity, ideology, democracy, power, and trust for outlets including the Washington Post and BBC. He lives here in Washington, D.C., and holds MPhil and PhD degrees from the University of Cambridge. Samuel, please join us here, and I invite the panelists to join us as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Brendan. We're really actually delighted to be on this panel, and it's going to be taking a kind of tact to a topic which is on everyone's minds, and we're going to intersect that in a quite unique way, I think. All three of our panelists are, I would say, like real experts and at the cutting edge of this conversation about democracy, both in terms of the kind of the evaluative sense, like where are we with our democracies, but also I would say, and like very much to all of their credit, to the constructive side. So I will, just to run through this quickly, I'll introduce our panelists. I'll then give a couple of introductory remarks about how we frame this session, what we're thinking about. Then our panelists will each give like 5-minute discussion about their own view of democracy, whether they think beauty is an appropriate category for democracy, and if so, how. And then we will run into kind of a back and forth with you and among ourselves. I really do want this session to be quite participatory, so when, actually even at the beginning, after each person has given their initial introduction to their own views about democracy, feel free to raise your hands and we'll go ahead and get a mic to you. And we'll take like 1 or 2 questions at that stage. And then after everybody is gone, then we'll also do a lot more kind of interactive discussion. So let me just say a few words, first of all, about the question of beauty and politics. When we think of politics, beauty is not always the first word that comes to mind, I would say. When we think about what we want from politics, it's often other categories, things like stability, neutrality, possibly justice, fairness, economic opportunity. But I will say that the idea of using aesthetic categories for politics goes back to really the beginning of our civilizations. So to take a quick example, there's as you all I'm sure know, there's a great hymn written to the Egyptian pharaoh Senusret III. And in it, he's praised for all kinds of things having to do with strength and being able to slit people's throats extremely quickly. He's also praised for having divine form. That kind of language of a kind of aesthetic form runs through all kinds of praise of kings, but it also runs through our praise of political systems. So famously, when Plato writes his great work, The Republic, he names the city that he's praising Kallipolis, meaning the beautiful city. And this is like the sort of extended meditation on the Kallipolis. Aristotle uses the word for beauty over 700 times in his work, The Politics, about all kinds of things, but also including things like laws and the state. And then when we think about like more famous things like praising Rome as a beautiful city, or like Ethiopia as a beautiful land, are these things about the landscape itself, or are they somehow about the civilization? So that's just to say, praising politics as beautiful seems strange, but it is also very common and something that seems to get down to something important, which we can talk about. We also, the last direction to come into this topic, we live in a time of real political passion, and language like beauty sort of takes the idea of politics out of the head and sort of into the blood. It makes it so that we kind of remember that politics has to do with love and hate, frustration, and desire. And when Brandon and I were talking about this panel initially, one of the inciting things is the way that the language of beauty is making it into our politics in a kind of troubling way. So I just want to pull out a paragraph from a speech that Viktor Orban, the premier of Hungary, gave in the last 5 years. And I'll emphasize that it's mixing aesthetic and sort of militaristic or belligerent categories together. So he says, "Ours is the world's most beautiful country. God has given us the world's most beautiful language. Our territory is the birthplace of the world's most talented people who make vitamin C from paprika, who make cubes that can be twisted and untwisted, and who fell previously unknown viruses with targeted shots from vaccines." Okay, some stuff. But then he says, "This is all very fine, but it is not enough. Beauty, ingenuity, generosity will only make a contented country if they are combined with strength. Let us first have strength and then be right rather than the reverse." Right, so you have these kinds of like attractive themes that have to do with drawing people in through these like implicit sort of deeper senses, but then he says like what this should power is the idea of muscle or strength. So these are very visceral words, and I think the way that I'd like to take this conversation, so we'll be able to talk through some of the unique ways, and our three panelists actually have quite different views about democracy, which I think will make this quite interesting, but all of them really like it. So that's helpful. When we go through this conversation amongst ourselves, but also with you, I just want to say it's very allowable to come to the conclusion, one, democracy is not beautiful. That's not a good category to be using. You could also say beauty should not be in politics at all. We like the just neutrality or just language like justice to describe politics. And then we can also like explore what kinds of categories of beauty do seem appropriate or inappropriate when we're talking about politics as a whole and democracy specifically. So with that said, I will just quickly introduce our panelists and then hand it over. So to start with, Hélène will go first. She is professor of political science with emphasis on political theory at Yale, and she leads the Democratic Innovations Program, which is really interesting, and you should look it up. She is author of many relevant and interesting books, especially on themes of democracy, including recently an excellent book called Debating Democracy, in which she argues explicitly that the way out of our current political problems is more democracy rather than less democracy. And then Osita Nwanevu, who's here to my left, is contributing editor at The New Republic and a columnist at The Guardian. He also has a forthcoming book on democracy called The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding, which is out with Random House next year. And then finally, Shadi Hamid is senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He writes very widely on democracy, including explicitly defending what he calls minimalist democracy, including in a book from last year entitled The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. So without further ado, Hélène, if you'd like to begin, it'd be wonderful to hear your comments. Then we can see if there are any quick questions, and then we'll go to Shadi and to Osita.
Much for having me, and I apologize for not being there with you in person. So I come at this question as of beauty and democracy as a political space who's rather critical of democracy as we know it. And to my mind, what characterizes electoral democracy is ugliness rather than beauty at the moment. And for that, I would blame a mix of things: partisan politics, which leads to polarization and hatred between groups; the role of money in politics, which corrupts and distorts both souls and policy outcomes; and finally, capitalism and the profit motive, which both seem deeply intertwined with our democratic systems and produce disharmonious, consumerist, hyper-extractive, and environmentally unsustainable outcomes. But I do think there is beauty in something that should be, within the democratic ideal, but that's becoming harder and harder to combine in democracies as we know them, which is the fact of coming together as one people and being able to make collective decisions about our common fate in a way that respects the plurality and diversity of our individualities and singular opinions. This coming together in harmony is truly beautiful and inspiring, and it is a promise of democracy that I think we need to reconquer. So that's why my work has been, about trying to reinvent what we mean by democracy and how we institutionalize it. And I just wanted to throw in the discussion a quote that I like very much by W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist. He understood the nature of democracy as a complete way of life, not just a political system, and he cast the argument for democracy in a way that gives a central role to beauty, it turns out. When I first read him, I thought he was an epistemic Democrat, and I thought, well, just like me, who believe that one of the virtues of democracy is to aggregate knowledge and get all the information that's distributed in the entire populace to generate better outcomes. But it's actually much more than that for him. In a passage from an essay from Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil, titled "On the Ruling of Men," he argues, he says, I quote, "The vast and wonderful knowledge of this universe is locked in the bosoms of its individual souls. To tap this mighty reservoir of experience, knowledge, beauty, love, indeed, we must appeal not to the few, not to some souls, but to all." End of quote. And what's really striking to me is that what he means by wisdom is a lot more exhaustive and all-encompassing than what I mean by it, which is, he means really things like beauty and love. It's not just information or scientific knowledge or even lived experience. It's truly these aesthetic dimensions as well, and even erotic dimensions, right, in the sense of love-related aspects. So how do we recuperate the promise of democratic wisdom, including wisdom as love and beauty? For that, I place my hopes in an alternative model of democracy that I call open democracy, which is a system in which ordinary citizens, rather than professional politicians, directly or in turn get to shape the laws that govern all of us. And they do so not just by counting votes, but by deliberating with each other until they can come to an agreement that works for everyone. So of course, this model of open democracy does not exist fully yet as a system, but I've seen it sort of emerge in bits and pieces in various parts of the world, and particularly in my native country of France, where we've conducted citizens' assemblies in the last 4 or 5 years, involving randomly selected citizens who managed to come together, above and beyond their disagreements and their differences and their singularities. So that gives me hope that we can perhaps scale this kind of processes and recuperate the promise of beauty in democracy. So I would love to give you examples. I hope I'll get a chance to give you examples in the Q&A maybe, because I wanted to keep this relatively short. So that was my main point.
Lovely. So are there any quick reactions? Yeah, please. Can we have a... Yeah, the mic should come to you. This is our attempt to be not fully aristocratic as we structure this panel.
2 very quick questions. One, does open democracy mean something like democracy by consensus? And 2, isn't it more like republicanism to favor the protection of minorities? And democracy, pure democracy, doesn't really respect minorities.
coming together, in harmony and getting to an agreement does seem to require a consensus, but it's not a forced consensus, and it's not a consensus that's meant to crush minorities. And so I think this view, I think the two questions are related in a way. I think this view that democracy means the tyranny of the majority has been very damaging to the way we've sort of institutionalized democracy. I think we've feared so much the tyranny of the majority that we've created systems that are in fact too minoritarian, and instead of protecting vulnerable minorities, they've actually empowered already powerful minorities to the detriment of both majorities and vulnerable minorities. So I'm not saying the tyranny of the majority is not a real concern, but if anything, I think the problem now is rather the opposite, is capture powerful minorities. So just want to say, no, open democracy is meant to do this, right? Allow the group to get to an agreement that everybody can recognize themselves in, and let minorities flourish, but not necessarily through the usual sort of constitutional counter-majoritarian devices that in the end empower much more the already powerful than the vulnerable.
This is actually going to be, I think, one of the principal things that we all debate and have tensions around, actually, this specific issue. Do you want to just say one thing about, give one tangible example of this kind of open democracy model that you've been working with?
Actually, so I was on the governance board of the Convention on End of Life that took place in France from December 2023 to April 2022 to April 2023. And on the last session, after 9 weekends of 3 days, the citizens rendered a report on the recommendations to handle end-of-life issues in France. And half the report was about palliative care, which is what the minorities cared the most about, the minorities opposed to assisted dying and euthanasia. And the rest of the report was about, conditions under which some form of assisted dying should be allowed according to the 185 citizens that had been part of the process. And it took a lot of work, a lot of deliberation, and a lot of compromises and effort on both sides to get there. And during the last one of the last meetings, the minority leader, the informal minority leader, the person who was very vocal and fighting for that group, raised her hand, and she said, "I want to thank the majority for giving us half of the speaking time and half of the report." And it tells you something about how, even on something as fundamental, it's fundamental disagreement whether you think that one should be able to end one's life or not. And they came to a conclusion that even though 75% of the group was in favor of liberalizing the law France to allow for some kind of assisted dying, the minority supported the report, thanked the majority, and in the end, 92% of the people in this assembly voted for the report. So I think it's an example of how the bonds that were created in this assembly, they were bonds of friendship and love, led to a sort of harmonious, not process throughout. There were moments of conflict and disharmony, but a harmonious outcome, respectful of minority views.
Lovely, thank you so much. So now we'll go to Shadi. Do you want to speak from, okay, great.
It's on? It's on? Okay. So when I was first invited, the question was really intriguing to me. And basically, I had to form a position in real time, because I actually previously did not have an explicit position on the question of what is beautiful about democracy, or even another version of the question, which is democracy beautiful in the first place? So it was an interesting experiment for me to see what would be the process of coming to a position on something I hadn't previously thought much about, which got me thinking about how do we come to have positions in the first place? And I think that as I've gotten older, I've come to maybe a tentative conclusion that we don't really have firm political opinions, that we start off with a certain set of moral intuitions and aesthetic sensibilities, and then we use politics to then describe the manifestation of moral intuitions and aesthetic sensibilities. So there's something very contingent about our political positions. They could have been otherwise. So if you took my same genetic material, but put me in a different context, growing up in a different place, having different friends, I would have different political positions. So in this life, in this world, me talking to you, I do think democracy is beautiful, but I can certainly imagine counterfactual histories where I wouldn't think democracy is beautiful. I do want to just linger on the aesthetic sensibilities of this. So in my book, as Sam mentioned, I proposed something called democratic minimalism. Now, until I was invited to speak here, I didn't actually make a certain connection. Because when I look at my apartment, so when I came here earlier today from my apartment, I looked around myself, and it is very much a minimalist aesthetic. Is there a relationship between the fact that I like democratic minimalism and that I also like minimalist design? Could there be something there? Okay, so that's one thing. I also, when I was invited to speak on this topic, I went back through my Twitter from over the past several years, and I searched for anything, any kind of link between democracy and beauty. Only one thing came up, but I think it was instructive. It was the day after Biden won in 2020, and it was just a very simple tweet. It was, to quote myself, alternation of power is a beautiful thing. So I thought about that. What does it mean to say that alternation of power is a beautiful thing? I think there is something, let's say, minimalist about it. And you just think about it. In a lot of countries, there isn't peaceful transfer of power, or really any kind of alternation of power. So there's also a question here of contrast. Because I have lived under 3 authoritarian regimes, I can make a certain kind of comparison, and with that in mind, democracy seems more beautiful to me than it otherwise might seem if this is all you've ever experienced. It was interesting listening to Hélène just now, because she said that there are aspects of our democracy now that are ugly, that there's an ugliness. And I guess I would have to disagree, and ultimately this is all subjective, right? I do think there's something beautiful about conflict, about dissonance. I'm actually quite suspicious of consensus, or even an aspiration to consensus. I'm suspicious of harmony. I don't want to live in a harmonious country. I don't necessarily want us to all come together as one. I find beauty in dissonance, which also makes me think about the kind of music that I like. And as I reflected on this, I realized that I have a very particular taste in music that emphasizes dissonance over harmony. And not to go into there's a particular genre of music, if any of you want to Google it later, it's called shoegaze. And it is very much oriented around a certain kind of dissonance and contrast between the different elements of the music. Anyway, I'll just close with a couple final points to just put it out there, because this is important. We are at Catholic University, so I should say something about the divine. I think that democracy at some fundamental level is beautiful because it is in line with who we are and how God made us. This is, I think, essential to my view. If I have to dig deep, I didn't always realize this was the case. It's only over the past few years, with friends pushing me, including Sam, that I started to realize that a lot of my views on democracy were quite tied to my belief in God. And, you know, so if there is beauty in the divine, which I believe as a believer, then almost by definition, there would be beauty in any system that is more closely aligned with our nature, with our innate disposition, with the way that God meant us to be. And because I have particular views about how God meant us to be, that we should have some control over our destiny, agency to make decisions, that we should be consulted on the things that matter to us, and that there should also be some level of freedom to make choices, because without that freedom, you can't really have virtue and vice. There is a kind of test here. And democracy, in a way, is a test. It's saying that we will give you freedom to make choices, to choose your own leaders. Sometimes you'll make terrible decisions. Sometimes you'll make good decisions, which I think is sort of a microcosm of life. So ultimately, I think that we should interrogate our starting premises on questions of the divine, and that can help us have a better sense of the question and how we would answer it, which is, what is beautiful about democracy? And here I've given a couple examples that are resonant for me. So, yeah, here you go.
Any quick questions, reactions that you want to have? This idea of the thing that's beautiful about democracy being conflict? Yeah, up here. I'll have this sprightly person run to you.
Thanks. I just really appreciate your saying that you distrust harmony and consensus, and I just wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that. That's an interesting observation.
Great question, because it might seem counterintuitive at first. So part of it is I don't believe consensus is any longer possible. In the pre-modern period in certain societies, I believe it was. And therefore, let's say in various Islamic and Christian empires or caliphates and what have you, there wasn't democracy in the way that we understand it today. And maybe that was okay then, because there was a kind of moral consensus in many of these societies. First of all, they tend to be a lot smaller, relatively small populations. And for example, in various Muslim caliphates, everyone believed that Sharia Islamic law was the ultimate source of legitimacy, and of course Sharia came from God, so God is ultimately sovereign in that sense. So, but in the modern period, we don't have any kind of moral consensus about the nature of the good. We live, all of us, certainly all of us in this room, live in diverse, complex, large, populous countries and societies. So with that context in mind, and also the fact that we have unprecedented levels of educational attainment and access to information, this means that we are never going to agree on the foundational questions. And those, of course, are the most important questions because they're foundational, they're existential to one degree or another. So I think we just have to accept that reality, that we will never again, at least for the rest of our lives or for the foreseeable future as far as we can foresee it, be able to return to a place of moral consensus. So that's one thing, that it's just about the way we are and the fact that we have this kind of kaleidoscope of opinions, views, orientations, convictions about the good. And there is something, I think, generative about that, because what comes out of that is a certain level of creativity. You can't really have creativity without some degree of conflict. So part of it is practical, acknowledging that this is the way it is, but part of it is also, and maybe this is just my bias, I do find that there is something generative about being in a kind of conflict with other people, and I see it in my own friendships, my own podcast debates. I always feel more excited and invigorated when the people who I'm talking to are pushing me or challenging me.
That's great. So let's go ahead and go to Osita, and then we'll kind of pull this all together into a context where we can actually do some of that, like kind of intellectual tension between a variety of views.
So, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the Beauty at Work Symposium for inviting me here. I feel truly honored and humbled to be here, largely because I feel like I shouldn't be here. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I don't study aesthetics. I'm here mostly in my capacity as just some guy. A guy who, like most people, likes beautiful things, but really hasn't the foggiest idea what beauty is or means. I don't know. So let's start there. What does it mean for something to be beautiful? The report this conference was convened around, of course, doesn't offer us the definition of the beautiful or clear consensus from the scientific community about what beauty means. But it does helpfully remind us of the ways that beauty defies clear definition. We say we find the beautiful in symmetries and asymmetries, in systems and objects both elegantly simple and impressively complex. Beauty is a word that we give freely to very dissimilar things. And even when we come to agreement that certain works of visual art, or pieces of music, landscapes, or people are beautiful, we may well differ on the attributes that have earned them that distinction. All this is to say that I can't say much at all with confidence about the beautiful. But like everybody else, I do have certain basic intuitions about all this. First off, it seems to me that beautiful things are appealing. They are pleasurable to our minds and senses. Not the most interesting observation, of course, but that is at least a bit of firm ground to stand on. It also seems to me that the things that we call beautiful are often rare or difficult to access. Most of us seem quite sure that most art, music, landscapes, and people are not beautiful. There are those who encourage us to see beauty in the everyday and commonplace as though they disagree. For all I know, which isn't much, they may well have grounds for doing so. But I think even they would concede that finding beauty in the everyday takes work, that it's a way of thinking about your experiences and surroundings that doesn't come easily, that to stop and smell the roses, one does actually have to stop, and that stopping to observe and admire something for its own sake amidst the chaos of life is hard. The sun's rise may well be beautiful on all or most days. Seeing it, unfortunately, is a rare treat for most of us. So this is beauty partially sorted. Beauty is either rare or not easily appreciated. Beauty is appealing. But we don't find the same things appealing, or find them appealing for the same reasons. On July 16, 1945, a man by the name of Thomas Farrell wrote in his journal about the extraordinary sights he'd witnessed over the desert landscape in New Mexico's Jornada del Muerto basin that morning. The whole country, he wrote, was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun. It was golden, purple, violet, gray, and blue. It lighted every peak, crevasse, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described, but might be seen to be imagined. It was that beauty that the great poets dream about, but describe most poorly and inadequately. That great beauty had been produced, as the physicists here may already know, by the Manhattan Project's Trinity test, the first ever detonation of a nuclear weapon. And like Farrell, the project's deputy commander, there have been many people, sometimes despite themselves, wanting to think or feel differently, who have found beauty in destruction or chaos, bloodshed and violence, sometimes, as in Farrell's case, literally in the weapons and wages of war. Beauty appeals to the senses, but whose senses? Who is the perceiving subject? The wonders of nuclear physicists were not experienced as beautiful by those on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some of the luckiest of those who experienced those events, who saw all that Farrell saw up close, never made use of their eyes again. Far less grandly, we might think here about our own dress, all we do to make ourselves presentable and attractive, a bit more beautiful in the course of our everyday lives. It probably behooves us to wonder, when we buy a dress or a shoe that's fetching to our eye, whether the worker is working for half a pittance, some of them children, stitching them together by the thousands day in and day out, see them in quite the same way that we do. Beauty in some is a troubled tangle. It vexes and beguiles, and it reminds me in this way of democracy. We've all been wrestling with that word in this country for the last couple of years, and the last couple of centuries. Like beauty, it's deceptively simple, freighted despite its attractive features with a real darkness. We're all taken from time to time with the romance of the protest, of the town hall meeting, the excitement of a political campaign, the simple pleasures, at least for the most civic-minded among us, of Election Day itself. Going into a church or a school, perhaps, and having your voice recorded as though it matters. And sometimes it really does. But to take democracy as seriously as an idea is to acknowledge the ever-present risk that when all the bunting and balloons have been taken down, the smiling volunteers have gone home, and the last I voted sticker has been handed out, we might find that we or our fellow citizens have chosen people who will do ugly and terrible things, or may have chosen those things ourselves. To prosecute wars without reason, to persecute the helpless, to take children away from their parents, to send agents of the state into libraries so that the state might substitute its own sense of beautiful for our own. Why then do we persist? What makes democracy worthwhile given all that can go wrong? For me, it's largely a matter of power, incentives, and agency. If governance is to benefit the governed, it's best left to the governed themselves, rather than authorities that cannot be trusted to act reliably in or be held accountable to their interests. There are some who additionally offer an aristocratic defense of democratic processes. Given all the collected knowledge and the diversity of perspectives we bring to the table when we make decisions together, it is plausible that the masses are more likely to be right than wrong in their judgment. Or more right than the few or individual ruler acting alone would be. But as much as these views might have to recommend them, there's an aesthetic dimension to democracy that they leave aside. There's much discussion upon the death of Queen Elizabeth last year about the sublime character of monarchies, even ones reduced to figurative status, the traditions that make the British royals so important to many, all of the symbolism that was on display during King Charles's coronation. And I fully concede that there are things that one might find beautiful in all the pomp and circumstance of all that. But to my mind, hereditary monarchy is a system in itself, is a grubby and small thing. The crown jewels sparkle brightly, but what you have in a monarchy is a system of rule built around getting the right people to copulate with each other. It is a simple and sordid business that never really changes. Democracy, by contrast, is something at once stranger and more grand. Thousands or millions, and all of their differences and mutual hostilities somehow, implausibly, acting together to collective ends. A system that is not only buttressed by its own strange rituals and ceremonies, but that often seems quasi-mystical even in substance. Consider the concept of representation, the idea that people might be chosen to go to some faraway place and act in our stead, perhaps as though we ourselves would have. Anyone who's ever tried to get a hold of their congressman knows, as a democratic theorist does, how fraught this idea can be in practice. And part of the trouble is that we're not really sure how close the resemblance is supposed to be between ourselves and our representatives. Is a representative body truly, in the ideal form, a true mirror of the public at large, warts and all? Or are our representatives supposed to be refined and improved versions of ourselves, the public rendered, in a sense, more beautifully? These are questions of political theory, but I call them aesthetic ones too because they are, importantly, also questions of perception. And it seems plain today that one of democracy's main problems is an image problem. I don't know that most Americans would say that democracy as they experience it, or believe they experience it, is beautiful. Though I don't know that most Americans would say that democracy needs to be beautiful. Most people, I think, tend to think about democracy as infrastructure. A good democracy for most is something like good plumbing, a vital system of pipes that ought to be kept in working order, but not thought much about besides as we busy ourselves with the business of life. And most Americans today think that system of pipes has gotten perhaps hopelessly corroded. It's busted and leaking sewage everywhere. It has interrupted and polluted the business of life. Most Americans just want those pipes fixed. They don't need to see beauty within them, they just want them to work. But I think making democracy work takes commitment, patience, perseverance, a willingness to suffer and sacrifice for the sake of the system. If we aren't bound tightly to it, it will fail. We will strain for alternatives, and those alternatives will be worse. It would be good, given this, if we could develop an understanding of democracy that puts something like beauty at its center, to see it as more than just plumbing, more than just infrastructure, to develop a sense that it might do grand and extraordinary things for us, because I think it might. Democracy, at the end of the day, is about taking responsibility for our own existence, not shoving that responsibility onto someone else. We fail and we learn and we grow together. If there's a way we improve as human beings, that is it. I don't know that I would say democracy is beautiful, but it is a well from which beauty might spring.
So maybe one quick question from the audience, and then we'll do a little bit of cross conversation. Anybody want to respond to that? I think especially like the thing that I found really provocative there is this idea of democracy not as an infrastructure project, that there's something else about it. Any quick reactions? Okay, so in that case, I want to pick up something maybe all three of you can talk about, and that is this question of simplicity. So part of what seems to be going on, say, in the Egyptian hymn to Pharaoh, is this idea that you can just consolidate political power in a very non-complicated way, and that there's like a luminosity here, right? And there's, in aesthetic categories, this idea of simplicity is often deferred to, including within the sciences, but in many other contexts. So when you think about democracy, are you actually kind of going the opposite direction? Maybe Shadi, you can start with this, where you want to say what's beautiful about democracy is that it's not simple, like that there's complication or conflict in the language you were using earlier?
Yeah, so I suppose another question is, what does it mean for something to be simple? I mean, I guess there's a couple different ways of looking at it. I mean, at some level, I do think democracy as a procedural system is straightforward. I think it's easy for people to grasp. You have periodic elections to choose your leaders. And there's alternation of power because people have the right to change their minds every, 4 or 5 years. Okay, straightforward, done. Authoritarianism, is that simple? I don't know. I guess the idea of having a dictator who imposes his will is simple in a way. It removes any kind of responsibility or agency from the individual. I guess that's simple, but is it straightforward? I mean, so I would say for me, the procedural system of democracy is in a sense simple, but then what democracy enables or allows is quite complicated. It's uncertain. And I think that in that sense, democracy is a bit like life or even love, that it is uncertain. You don't know what is going to happen. And that can be very frightening for people. You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to take a risk. It's also similar, I suppose, to the afterlife. We don't know entirely for sure whether we're going to go to heaven, hell, something in between, or nothing at all. We have our intuitions. We might be 99% sure, but we can't be 100% sure, which is sort of like an election. Like, even if the polls are very clear, you're still not 100% sure.
Do you want to speak to this?
I would actually flip that on its head. I think that democracy as a procedural thing is fantastically complicated, just as on the matter of mathematics. I don't want to bore people about errors and possibility theorem and vote cycles and ranked choice voting, all of it, but it is extremely complicated. And we tell ourselves when an election is over that something very simple has happened. We tell ourselves a simple story. The people have spoken. There is a group of people, there is the people. There was a majority, a single majority of the people that spoke. And on the basis of what everybody collectively decided in that majority together, we're going to go and do this thing. It becomes this way of simplifying society and shrinking it to the level where we can sort of work with it in our own heads and tell ourselves that when government acts, it is acting in the interest of this thing called the people and majority. And so I think, I think that there's once you kind of delve into the mechanics of democracy, there's a point where the complexity becomes unsettling because you realize that that story isn't true, and you have to sort of rebuild for yourself in a sense of like what is even happening and why it's important and why it's worthwhile.
Does that sort of fantasizing function where you win an election and then you say the American people decided such and such, does that trouble you at all?
It does.
Okay.
It does, and I think that there are better stories we could tell that would be more in line with what is actually happening on the level of like statistics, mathematics, but that also would be inspiring, and that would also get people to believe democracy is still worthwhile, even if the thing about the will of the majority isn't true. I think we can recover a sense of democracy that's still spiritually enriching and important, even though the old story doesn't really hold water. But I am troubled by the extent to which we don't really interrogate in this country what it is we're actually doing when we go to the polls. We're just sort of comfortable with the fact that we run elections in such a way that most of the time, if most people who go to the polls vote against somebody and the person at the top happens to win a plurality, that person's going to get the position, the office, and the thing that most people who voted against that person don't have. We don't think about that. We don't really internalize that. And I think that there's a lot of mischief in ignoring that and politicians kind of adopting the language of the majority, the people, without ever really letting people into what's actually going on, you know?
Hélène, do you want to speak maybe to both of these things that we just brought up? So to the simplicity question a little bit, and also, I mean, maybe you can even say in a little bit in your own work, are you kind of pushing to simplify it a little bit, the nature of democracy? And then maybe you can talk a little bit about these majority-minority dynamics like Osita was just.
I think I am indeed trying to return to a simpler understanding of what democracy is about. I think it's about people coming together, talking it out, and then taking a vote on the basis of one person, one vote. That's very simple. It's a simple heuristic where you don't have to figure out who's wrong or who's right. You just assume we're all roughly equal in our common sense. And then you just distribute the power equally and you tally the votes and you go with the majority. It's that simple. And it's also a lot more transparent than the Byzantine sort of systems where you have an elite that makes decisions behind closed doors. You don't know what's really going on, who really has the power. And unfortunately, because the world is complex for historical reasons of past dependence, we've ended up, for example, in the US, with a system where you have checks and balances and separation of powers, which in theory are good things, but have made things completely opaque and unreadable. So now the legislative power is distributed over Congress, but also the executive, but also federal agencies. You don't know who's accountable for what. You don't know who's really behind the decisions. And you never have a sense of how to make people accountable for anything. The military is spending billions, trillions on without accountability. It's opaque, it's untransparent, it's incomprehensible. Same thing with the tax code. Then you have armies of lobbyists and people who have an interest in keeping things as complicated as possible. For me, democracy is when people understand the law is clear, the law is sort of accessible, and I don't think we live in systems like that. And yes, I hear already the objection, well, it's because the world is complex. I don't think our system needs to be that complicated, even in the face of a complex system.
Sorry, just to sort of build off something Hélène just said. I mean, I consider myself a critic of what people call American democracy. I don't think we are a democracy, and I spend a book arguing that. But one of the things that I think misleads people about the democratic character of this country is that we have so many damn elections at every level. We have a truly internationally remarkable number of elections, elected positions. We elect judges, in a way that I think people in other developed countries would find absurd. So we're always, going through the motions of democracy. We cast a lot of ballots. But I think to Helene's point, I think a lot of that just ends up making the system seem really confusing, and you don't really know who's accountable for what, and you can't keep track of everything that's going on, what elections are happening, what this position's about. Anybody who's ever voted in like a local election has experienced this, right? So there's a way in which everything that we call, or a lot of what we call democracy in this country is actually making the system, like Hélène said, more opaque and more inaccessible and more difficult to participate meaningfully in and in an informed way in.
Okay, so just listening to this back and forth right now, I couldn't help thinking, okay, this is kind of complicated. So I actually don't really have, I was trying to figure out like what's my opinion hearing Hélène and Osita, and I realized like I don't actually have a strong opinion one way or the other to share with you. I do think though that another aspect of beauty comes to mind, and I think democracy does allow for this, which is there's a beauty in letting go. There's a beauty in not having a position. There is a beauty in not knowing the law. There is a beauty in not knowing about the candidate that's standing for your local election. Politics is important, but it should never be the most important thing. And democracy is what allows us to make a decision on our own as individuals that we simply don't care enough to develop a particular position on a particular issue. And I think we need much more of that. Certainly in American democracy, we have to empower people to look elsewhere for meaning. So that to me is a beautiful thing. It's difficult to do, especially if you're well educated, and we're sort of conditioned to think that we have to feel moral and we have to take a moral position perpetually on everything that's going on. But I think that is a somewhat narrow view of morality. And I would also say that this brings me back to God. I think it's more possible to let go if this isn't everything. If you don't believe in God and if you don't believe in something after this, you're almost compelled to invest this life with a certain kind of meaning that is just unsustainable, untenable, and bound to collapse unto itself. But that's I think maybe a bigger debate.
Maybe let's go ahead and, I think, why don't we pull in 2, 3, 4 questions, actually. Questions and also maybe comments. So all of us are actually living in these societies and in these big democratic debates. So we've got one here and there. Let's do those 3 first, and then we'll pull in some more. Do you have a second microphone maybe that you can bring here to the middle row? Yeah. Yeah, please.
It's a difficult critique, really, to what the speakers are saying because we don't have much time. But I would say at the foundation of the problem, it seems to me the 3 of them agree in what I think is the crisis of democracy. That is to say, Professor Landemore, when she talks about her idea of an open democracy, this is not much different than Jürgen Habermas's idea of the theory of communicative action in democracy, right? You're familiar, right? So this is just, we dialogue, we take a vote, and then we go with that. And that this is the foundation of democracy, which is also where the other 2 speakers seem to be advocating sort of a John Rawlsian procedural democracy. As long as the procedure is fair, then we go with that. But that is precisely the crisis of democracy. It surprises me that Professor Landemore, who is a European, doesn't seem to count on the fact that having the procedure or having the dialogue and taking the vote and going with that is also what gave us Hitler in Germany, right? Hitler was voted democratically into power. The Anschluss in Austria in 1938 was also democratically sound from the procedural point of view. So this is no assurance of justice, and this was also the fatal flaw of Jürgen Habermas's program. You have not responded how you ensure that just ends are achieved just because you have a dialogue and have consensus.
Okay,
Last
good.
point that I'll make.
Yeah.
If you can have consensus or a procedural vote on anything, which is seemingly what the 3 of you are saying, could we have a vote on let's enslave Black people again in America, and we will have a vote, and if the vote turns out favorable, we will just adopt that, and that is democracy.
Good.
I think this is the antithesis of democracy, when you don't have any non-negotiables and don't even understand how to reach them.
Okay, good. Yeah. So basically, the question I think will be the tension between the justice as an end and whether democracy itself can give you an unjust end in that sense. That's great. Let's go ahead and take the other 2, and then we can put them. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is just a follow-up clarification question on the last comment that Dr. Hamid made. Are you advocating for a less informed, less caring electorate and voting public because God's going to make it okay in the end, and we should just trust that that's the case?
Good. 2 provocative questions so far.
Mine is also for Shadi. So you were talking about we need to return to this, or we can maybe never return to this time of consensus, like under Islamic caliphates, other historic systems of government. And I guess my question is, was there real homogeneity of thought in those cultures, or was there just not representative democracy that would illuminate dissent and tensions in those cultures?
I think these questions actually go nicely together. Maybe Hélène. Yeah, please. Yeah, the microphone can come to you. Just a second, Hélène. We'll take one more from the audience. Sorry, just a second.
I think your comment was very astute, because at the time of the Civil War, the majority of Americans actually weren't pro-slavery. And I had leaned to my friend and said I would still be a slave under those circumstances. And so I understand the wisdom of crowds, but not always.
The procedure did not end this problem, right? The consensus did not end the problem of slavery in America. Exactly.
Yeah, good. No, that's good. And I think this comes to, I think actually like a very significant question, which has shown up today already, which is related to the transcendence of beauty, and I think also the transcendence of ideals like justice. So in order for democracy to be beautiful, do you need some vantage point that is not simply subject to democracy? And I think that's a really clear way to kind of think of this. So Hélène, go ahead. Why don't you address this, and then we can go to this too. Yeah.
The point again about minority rights and potential abuses of a majority, but then of course I agree. And in fact, I'd give you what the answer that Habermas would give is that, the rules are not just the rule. They contain in themselves their own conditions and limits in a way that you've got some constraints on majoritarian power that are coeval, as Habermas puts it, with the very notion of democracy. So you'd have human rights, a set of liberal rights like freedom of speech, right to vote, freedom of religion, etc. It's in that context that I'm just advocating for greater majorities, but I'm not talking about returning to a sort of pre-liberal age like the ancient Greece where none of that was constitutionalized. But that's what's interesting when you go back to ancient Greece is that you find out that the democracy itself, without the liberal framework, was able to generate protections for fundamental rights that we would, I think, consider liberal, like certain provisions on freedom of speech, so that people could say what they want in the assembly, things like that. So there was an internal logic of just the democracy framework that was already providing certain things that we're used to considering, counter-majoritarian or liberal. So I think that's one aspect. I think it's important to also realize that those two things that there's a certain autonomy of the democratic framework. But of course, like the question of who's included in the demos is fundamental, and before almost the question of, okay, once we have demos, how do we settle our disagreements? Consensus also, I just wanted to just make a point about what I mean by it. I don't mean unanimity and a sort of crushing, thick set of background norms. For me, consensus is a product of the deliberation, not a precondition for it necessarily. It's not something that will require everybody to agree. It's not something that's permanent, and it's a trend. It's a temporary sort of fixed point in a continually changing and evolving discussion. We have to reach decisions, so it's better if more of us agree than fewer, I would say. So that's what I mean by that. And then just a point about the glorification of conflict. I would say that historically, for me at least, it's a very sort of male and elitist thing to push, because conflict really means, it means divorce, it means blood and wars and death. I don't think there's anything that beautiful about it. Maybe you can say it from the outside, from a Nietzschean perspective, if you want, but from the inside, I don't see anything desirable about it. I think it's something that we strive to avoid as individuals, and our politics. I'm not saying it should be all roses and harmony all the time, but it's much more livable when you try to be civil and respectful and listen to each other.
So I don't have a consensus-based view of democracy or why it's important. I think it would be terrific, actually, if we were to, vanquish conflict and difference and disagreement and deep disagreement from society. And I don't know that we can. I think that efforts to do that have actually been quite bloody and violent and redolent with all the things that we tell ourselves is bad about conflict. So my view of democracy is closer to Shadi's, where I think is a way of adjudicating and sort of explaining our differences to ourselves, and through debate and discussion and dialogue, this constant process of reforging coalitions is the way we kind of get around conflict being something that leads to bloodshed. Ideally, I think somebody said in all of my reading that I've done over the past years, the democracy is fundamentally about uncertainty, and the idea that there's this constant negotiation and it's never really settled, but you're giving people the agency that they need to have some measure of control over their lives and to sort of play that out over and over and over again in different ways, which I think is one of the things that I think we should consider on this question of minority rights and the dangers democracy may pose to people who find themselves on the wrong side of the vote. If democracy is fundamentally about, as I think it is, granting people a measure of agency and control over their lives, giving everybody the opportunity to govern in some capacity, something like slavery becomes impermissible from that standpoint. Something like sending people to the gulag or the gas chamber is impermissible because you're not treating that person as somebody with agency. You're not treating that person as somebody who has an equal right, an equal share in governance. And so, I think that allows us to say that there should be constitutional arrangements, whether that's the Supreme Court or some other similar way of adjudicating, checking, evaluating democratic decisions. I think that's entirely can be read as consistent with democracy. I know people will shunt that off into liberalism as something that's different and above democracy, but I think that there's a way you can read democratic values where you see institutions like that, and I'm not saying the institutions we have in the United States perform it well. I don't think they do. But I think that in principle, institutions like that could be reconciled with a system of democratic values if we think about the first principles in the right way.
Shadi, a lot of your work is on this topic, so.
Yes, I love these questions, and they go together quite well.
They're also targeting you specifically.
Oh, well,
so.
Hey. So the first thing I would say to the first questioner, it's precisely right. There is no guarantee of just outcomes or just ends in a democratic context. That it's not clear to me why that should be the necessary result. Democracy may be good, but good things can also lead to bad outcomes. And there's no way, at least not to my knowledge, of guaranteeing against bad outcomes. The only way to guarantee against bad outcomes is to not have democracy. It's to impose one way of looking at the world and saying that no other options will be considered. And then this goes back to the lack of moral consensus in the modern era. We don't know what just outcomes are. Or, to put it differently, we can't agree as citizens on what just outcomes are. So for us to say, well, this democratic process is leading to an unjust end, you may think it's an unjust end. I may think it's a just end because my first premises, like my basic conception of the universe, is fundamentally different than that of my fellow citizens. And that is the reality that we live in today in America. Chances are, if we did a poll right now, we would not have any fundamental agreement on some pretty foundational questions. And this brings me to a couple of the other points that were made, which are, I think, really good points. And I'll just be straight up. Yes, I am in part calling for lower information. I don't actually think information or knowledge are always unqualified goods. And we should all ask ourselves, as citizens of this country or whatever country, why do we automatically assume this to be the case? And I actually wrote a piece laying out the case. If you want to read more about it, it's called "You're Better Off Not Knowing." It was in the Atlantic 2 months ago. That is the full version of the case, and I stand by it. It's not clear to me that America has gotten better with more information, more knowledge, more people following the news, and I actually call on Americans to not follow the news. And I want to ask every single person here, how does it help you to know the ins and outs of Trump's indictment or any particular issue when you go to the New York Times homepage and it's there and it's making you panic about something that you have no control over, and it actually doesn't improve your life or anyone else's life in any kind of tangible way? We should follow the news on things that maybe we have a particular interest in, or things that are relevant to our work or our activism, or we should. But, honestly, beyond those cases, I would advise people to actually move away from the news and to instead think about foundational questions. And those are much better understood and acquired through things like religion, community, friendship, and so forth, not from reading the newspaper. And just the last point on whether pre-modern societies actually had consensus and were homogenous in some way. They were homogenous on foundational existential questions. So if you are, if you're a Muslim living under a caliphate, then you will not question, first of all, God's existence, or at least there's not a critical mass of people who they might maybe privately question God's existence in moments of doubt, but no one is advocating an alternative conception of the good, an alternative to the kind of Islamic system that we saw historically. What are some of these alternatives? Liberalism. Liberalism did not exist in the pre-modern era. And part of the challenge today in the Middle East is that there are now competing conceptions of the good, competing worldviews and systemic visions that were never there previously. Secularism as we understand it today, never existed in the pre-modern period. These are modern inventions and innovations. They might be good ones, but they simply did not exist in some of these pre-modern societies and civilizations in any kind of recognizable form.
So on this question of knowing things, I think it's good for people to be curious and interested in the things that are going on in the world around them and interested in how the world works. We're at a university. I think this is a good venue for that argument. I will say that if you're choosing a publication to drop from your news diet, you might well choose The Atlantic. I don't know. If you had to choose one to get rid, but at Shadi's point, it is debilitating. Just as somebody who covers the news day in and day out, it is deeply depressing and troubling, and it makes my heart hurt and it makes me scared sometimes. And I do despair for this country and the planet. But the work of living in society is hard. Shadi sounds a lot to me like Jason Brennan, actually, which is somebody I know Hélène knows well, who's made a very similar argument about tuning off and about how politics turns us into worse people, and we're not necessarily benefiting from it. This is a very common argument amongst libertarian critics of democracy. And whenever I hear people say this, I do sort of think back to how novel mass participation in democracy kind of is. So in the last 100, 150 years, we've had this surge of people swell in and participate in politics, women, African Americans, expanded access to democracy and the vote amongst the poor, and obviously people are doing their very best to roll those things back right now. But as we saw all of these people, by the millions, take a stand and take responsibility, again, for their existence in society, I don't know that the empirical record shows that America was worse off for those things having happened. I think that those people saw their own lives improve and that the country as a whole improved, got stronger, got more wealthy, got more enriched culturally, through mass participation, through people doing the difficult and often depressing work, yes, of being democratic citizens. And if we abandon that task, the people who are going to be left over to lord it over everybody else in politics are not going to be a representative group of the public. They're going to be people who are going to use the ignorance and the ambivalence of the rest of the public to their own ends. We're going to be taken advantage of in ways that I don't think we'd be comfortable with. So as hard as it is to watch the news, and yeah, you don't need to pay attention to everything, and you don't need to be on constant watch on CNN to see what door Donald Trump goes through in the Manhattan courthouse. Yeah, you can skip that, sure. But the actual work of being involved and getting to know about subjects that you might not know about and that might be at some distance from you in your own life, I'm sorry, that's just how democratic society functions. And we can do it. We've done, I think, an admirable job of that work through our history and over the last 150 years especially, and I would hate to see us abandon that work now.
Okay, but just to clarify one thing, I'm not saying that people shouldn't participate. I'm saying that there's different ways to participate, and they don't require having a lot of knowledge about particular issues. You should have the choice to completely ignore an entire, like very large sections of human existence if that's your preference. Ultimately, that falls back on the individual. I think it's much more useful to actually interrogate your first principles and like read religious texts in some monastery, and then, you know, that can actually give you a lot more insight into what fundamentally matters. You don't actually need to be aware of 99% of day-to-day developments in your society in order to know what your convictions are or your first principles are. But that's ultimately a personal choice that people make. I just want people to feel empowered to make that choice, and for those people to not be judged or dismissed as somehow being bad citizens or incomplete voters or something to that effect. And I think in left-leaning elite circles, there is an obsession with being knowledgeable. And that's part of what I want to challenge and problematize, if you will.
Okay, so let me, I want to take this conversation actually back towards some more philosophical principles quickly before we conclude. So it seems to me like there's an ambiguity in the kind of articulation we've had so far, which is whether it's democracy that's beautiful, or is it that democracy gives space for something beautiful about human life or human beings in some other way. And maybe you would say an essential aspect of what makes humans beautiful is agency or autonomy. Under an authoritarian regime that's not able to come out, democracy actually enables that or facilitates it. And this question about the news touches on it a little bit. It's sort of people have the autonomy also to not be very participatory, like to be able to draw back a little bit or to engage if they feel like it's important to them. So that's one side of it. The other side would be to say democracy itself actually has like a beautiful characteristic to it. And I'd be, maybe all three of you can comment on that now, and then we can see if there's like maybe one more question from the audience after we do.
Question to your question,
Nice.
Sam,
Yeah.
which is, what does it mean for democracy itself to be beautiful? Because what is the inherent content of democracy? I mean, can we really ever truly assess something or understand it outside of what it enables or empowers or produces? There's no way for us to kind of create an alternative world where all we have is the kind of perfect form and nothing else. Nothing of the results or outcomes of the form. The form does not exist outside of its context.
So this is like Socrates answering a question with like a paragraph-long question. So it seems like that was an answer. Osita, do you want to say anything?
I'm still hung up on what beauty is to begin with. You know, if people have more answers on that, please, help me out with that. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that for democracy to function, again, as I kind of said in my remarks, people have to think of it as like a beautiful or sublime system. I think it would help us improve democracy if people had that much of an investment. This sense that it should be beautiful in some way, or that it should contribute to human flourishing in some way that we don't really assume that it can right now. If people read their, John Dewey or whatever, I think that'd be great. I do, though, feel sufficiently confident in democracy as a system and as a way of thinking about the world to believe that it ought to be expanded substantially and expanded into different domains. I'm glad you gave me the mic, because I had to say this at some point, and I just needed to get the right opportunity. So we're at the Beauty at Work conference, and it was very inspiring and moving, actually, to read that report and see so many people say that they found beautiful things just within the course of doing their jobs as physicists or as biologists, the patterns that they noticed, all these systems that they got to take in and experience and figure out. That's wonderful. For most people, work is not beautiful. Work is not delightful. Work is a pain. It's a struggle. It's something that they barely tolerate. Some people do find a lot of joy in their jobs. I don't know that that is the majority of Americans or the majority of people in the world. As a matter of fact, I think that work has gotten worse in this country over the last half century or so. Workers now have fewer and fewer rights. Our bosses have more and more authority over us. We get less and less for the things that we do, it seems, or at least it seems that sometimes we're on a treadmill. And I think that these are all problems in some sense of agency. The economy is a realm where we do not actually have a lot of power to shape the conditions that order our lives. And I think that is a democratic problem. I think it's a problem that might admit some democratic solutions. As a matter of design, when we think about the structure of corporations, or even something just as basic as expanding labor rights. But I do think that work as a domain is something that ought to be democratized if we want to fully embody democracy in this country. And I think that that would actually have some, it would redound to the benefit of political democracy as well in all sorts of ways. I don't know if that counts as like a maximalist conception of democracy that Shadi would oppose. But I actually think it's not a maximalist. I think that if you take, again, the first principles of democracy seriously, that we want it because we want to have some measure of agency over our lives and the chaos of the universe. That basic idea is something that has very radical implications if you take it to its logical conclusions, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, so roughly it sounds like the case is there is something in humanity that's beautiful, including exercising agency. Democracy, as Hélène said at the beginning, seems a bit ugly at the start until you realize what it's making possible. Hélène, is that roughly, like in terms of how humans can live, is that roughly how your case works?
I think that the primacy is with individuals, right? We care about individuals rather than about systems per se. So to that extent, I think democracy is instrumental to the well-being, happiness, flourishing, freedom of individuals. So to that extent, I would say yes. What matters is that the beauty of individuals. I don't think the ugliness of the current system, however, turns into anything beautiful. I'm really disillusioned with that, and that's why I think that we have to reconnect with the idea of democracy and try to envision how it should translate institutionally. And I don't think it should translate institutionally anymore into the kind of electoral bickering, partisan politics that we're familiar with. Similarly, I completely agree with what's just being said, that the next frontier for thinking about democracy is probably the workplace. I'm part of the group of women. We've launched this movement, Democratizing Work. And we think that to the extent that there is domination, power, and questions of justice in the workplace, the answer probably is something along the lines of a democratic system or an equalization of power or an inclusion of voice for all stakeholders. So the bigger philosophical question that I'm not sure I can answer is what's the ultimate value, right? I mean, in Plato, beauty is not the ultimate value. It's just a getaway to a higher good, which is the good, or even before that, the truth, or other things, right? So what is it that we are after? And I don't think as a political theorist that I can answer that. I think that now we are entering the territory of indeed something like theology or religion. It's really difficult to answer.
Great. One more question from the audience, and then I'll have to give the mic back to maybe someone who hasn't. Yeah, back there at the very back.
Okay, this is awesome and been really great to listen to, so thank you. I'd like to ask specifically about the American system of government. So I think an important clarification is that we are not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. And something that I think is beautiful about the American system of government, particularly how it was created by our founders, is the balance between the three branches of government, the separation of powers, separation between the powers of the state and the federal government. I think there's a lot of balance, there's a lot of symmetry, and there's a lot of checks there, and I think that is beautiful. And I think it prevents against some of the true ugliness that pure democracy in like the simple majority type scenario that was spoken about earlier can create: mob rule, populism. And I think that, so I would just ask, is the American system of government as it was created with that federalism, those checks and balances, is that beautiful?
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'll actually just give this one to Osita. Yeah, so when you think about I think this is the theme that has come up with a lot of the questions, which is if you do want to embrace democracy, how does that not end up having a kind of tyranny to it? And I think you do have answers to that you've thought about carefully. So maybe you speak to that and tie it in with this question about America.
Yeah, on the question of the American system, once again, I'm very reluctant to make strong statements about the beautiful, generally speaking. But here, as with beauty in general, I do have my basic intuitions. And my basic intuition about the American political system is that it is terrible. The balance and this kind of sense that we have a well-tempered system, I think, is being challenged very well this particular week when we're all on tenterhooks waiting to see whether we're going to destroy the global economy as a consequence of this arcane, very stupid, and very internationally unique way of handling our debts. That's not a feature of the constitutional order as the framers created it, but it does sort of, I think, it should suggest to us that maybe it is the case that this thing of ours is a little ricketier than it should be in general, and that we should think about pursuing other arrangements. I would agree with you in that we are not a democracy. I don't know that I'd call us a democratic republic. I think I'd call us something like a minoritarian republic. John McCormick at UChicago, teases out different strands of the Republican tradition, the democratic Republican tradition, and the aristocratic Republican tradition. I think if you look at the founding and the impulses of the founders and all that they said at the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, you find generally that they are more in line with the aristocratic reading of what republicanism is and is about. If we did another conference on the founding, I could go on about this for like another hour, but we have like 30 seconds. But I think that what is beautiful to me about this moment, I will say maybe, is that it is calling into question some of the assumptions we've taken for granted about the nature of the system for a very long time. If we care about mob rule and populism and all of those scary things, it should matter to us that most Americans who went to the polls in 2016 did not choose Donald Trump as the person that they wanted to be president. Donald Trump was a product of the American constitutional order. That is why he was president. It was not because this writhing mass of antipathy and whatever actually captured most of the American people. He was there as a function of the way our political system is designed. He was sustained in office and not impeached as a function of the way our political system is designed. And I think that those things are becoming clearer and clearer to people. And I think we're at a moment of potential reinvention. That's beautiful, right? The idea that we can come together and create something new and that suits our purposes better. And the process of creation and rediscovery. I think that potentiality to me, I guess, feels beautiful. The American political system, to the extent that I have any kind of basic sense of what beauty is not beautiful to me, no.
Shadi, you're sort of often much more pro-American. Do you want to say just a few words about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we are currently a democracy. I mean, I'm not aware of any mainstream political. Well, there might be one or two, but the preponderance of mainstream political scientists would consider America today to be a democracy, a flawed one, perhaps, and we can add other modifiers to it. I mean, you're right that the founders weren't small d Democrats in the way that we understand the word today. I mean, there wasn't universal suffrage, for one. And we would not consider any country today that didn't have universal suffrage to meet even a minimalistic standard of democracy. So you're certainly right about the founding, but America today is a democracy. I guess I'd say I'm not thrilled about the idea of creating something new. And it's worked out pretty well up until now. Like, for all the faults, I mean, America is the most successful nation state in history. From my perspective, and I think that I'd be more than comfortable making that case pretty explicitly. This has been an incredible experiment. It's not perfect, but it's very hard for me to look at everything up until this moment and to say that this is a failure, or this is ugly, or this is bad, or that we have to have a new founding, a refounding. Be careful what you wish for, because whatever's new, and I don't know who is going to make this new thing, and I don't know what that's going to look like, and I wouldn't want to mess too much with a formula that has been pretty positive up until now. I mean, you can't have the good without the bad. There is no, so, you know, we introduce better things or good things in other areas in the US system. There are going to be profound trade-offs that we can't necessarily anticipate.
So I just want to say thank you to all three of you so much. This has been a real pleasure to be able to converse in this kind of way. I'll also say that the three of us in person spent at least a year and a half arguing about this topic behind the scenes, and you'll see that if you would like to all continue to argue over drinks, I'm sure that we'll have it resolved by the end of that conversation. But I do think the tone of like the questions and I think our interaction does indicate something about the importance of the question that Brandon set, which is there's something visceral in politics. And I think that that's on the surface for a lot of people at the moment, a way in which these questions pull out a kind of sensitivity and they have an intensity. And I think that that does relate to this idea that dropping from a register that where politics is just about the mind and sort of, like you were saying, engineering appropriate utility company for voting or whatever, into the blood and the place where it does actually happen. I think that that is actually an incredibly important question, and I'm really grateful to Brandon for setting it for us. Thank you to all of you, and I gather that we'll now get instructions for how we can go and continue to talk, but also hopefully drink, I would think.
That works. So